Have you ever found yourself overwhelmed by the weight of life's challenges, wondering if your tears even matter? Jeremiah, known as the weeping prophet, knew that pain all too well. Yet his story shows us something extraordinary. Every tear he shed reflected a heart aligned with God's, a heart that felt the deep love and sorrow of the Creator for his people. It's a story of unwavering hope in the midst of heartbreak. Jeremiah wasn't chosen because he was fearless or powerful. He was chosen because of his willingness to say yes to God, even when it cost him everything. His journey reminds us that God can use anyone, even in the most broken and uncertain moments, to bring light to others. Have you ever wondered if your struggles could serve a greater purpose? Jeremiah's life proves they can. In this journey, we'll explore why God called Jeremiah to such a unique and challenging role, and how his faithfulness, compassion, and perseverance hold timeless lessons for us today. Through his tears, we'll uncover the hope of a God who never stops loving us, even when we falter. Are you ready to let Jeremiah's story inspire your own? When we think of the great prophets in the Bible, we often imagine larger-than-life figures, fearless and unwavering in their mission. But Jeremiah's story begins in a surprisingly ordinary way. He was a young man from a small village, Anathoth, unsure of his abilities and deeply aware of his limitations. Does that sound familiar? Sometimes, God calls us to tasks that feel far beyond what we think we can handle. Jeremiah's first reaction was much like ours might be, "Ah, Lord God, behold, I cannot speak, for I am a youth." Jeremiah 1:6. God's response was as tender as it was firm. He assured Jeremiah that his youth and inexperience were no obstacle for God's purpose. "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you. I ordained you a prophet to the nations." Jeremiah 1:5. Imagine hearing those words. They remind us that God's plans for our lives were set long before we even took our first breath. He sees beyond our fears and equips us for his calling. Jeremiah was hesitant, and who could blame him? The task ahead was daunting. God was calling him to be his voice to a rebellious nation, a people who had turned away from their Creator. But God's promises to Jeremiah were clear. "Do not be afraid of their faces, for I am with you to deliver you." Jeremiah 1:8. Those words offer a timeless comfort to all of us who face challenges in our faith journeys. When God calls, he also provides the strength we need. One of the most beautiful moments in Jeremiah's calling is when God symbolically touches his mouth, saying, "Behold, I have put my words in your mouth." Jeremiah 1:9. It's a powerful reminder that when we feel unworthy or unprepared, it's not about our abilities, but God's power working through us. His strength is made perfect in our weakness. Jeremiah's reluctance is something many of us can relate to. How often do we feel inadequate when faced with a challenge? Yet just as God reassured Jeremiah, he reassures us. He reminds us that we are chosen, loved, and equipped for his purposes. In moments of doubt, his word becomes our anchor, reminding us that his plans are for good, even when they seem beyond our grasp. This story of Jeremiah's calling speaks directly to anyone who has ever felt unworthy or uncertain. It's not about where you come from or what you think you can do. It's about surrendering to the one who knows you completely and trusting his plans for your life. Jeremiah teaches us that even an ordinary person, full of doubts, can be used by God in extraordinary ways. As we step into Jeremiah's journey, let's pause and reflect. Where might God be calling you? Is there a task you feel unprepared for, a challenge that seems too great? Take heart in Jeremiah's example and God's assurance. He will be with you every step of the way. Jeremiah wasn't called the weeping prophet by accident. His tears were a reflection of the profound compassion and love he carried in his heart for God's people. Imagine being so connected to God's heart that you feel his pain for a wayward nation. That was Jeremiah. He wasn't weeping for himself, but for a people who had turned away from the very one who gave them life. His sorrow wasn't weakness. It was strength born of empathy. The people of Judah had fallen into idolatry, injustice, and rebellion against God. Jeremiah saw the consequences of their choices long before they did. Can you imagine the heartbreak of watching someone you love walk a path of self-destruction? Jeremiah's tears flowed not out of frustration, but from a deep desire to see them return to God. He stood in the gap, pleading with them to turn back before it was too late. His compassion was a direct reflection of God's love for his people. Jeremiah's heart was broken because God's heart was broken. This teaches us an important lesson. True compassion involves sharing in the burdens of others. It's not about pity, but about stepping into their struggles, even when it's uncomfortable. Jeremiah's tears remind us that love sometimes means carrying the weight of someone else's pain. Even in his sorrow, Jeremiah remained faithful to his mission. He didn't let discouragement stop him, even when his message was ignored or ridiculed. How often do we give up when faced with rejection? Jeremiah shows us that compassion isn't just about feelings, it's about action. It's about standing firm in love, even when it's hard, because the people we care for are worth it. The depth of Jeremiah's compassion can inspire us in our relationships today. In a world that often feels cold and disconnected, how can we show more empathy to those around us? It starts with listening, understanding, and praying for others, even when they don't realize they need it. Like Jeremiah, we are called to be vessels of God's love, pointing others to Him through our actions. Jeremiah's example also challenges us to examine our own hearts. Do we truly love others as God loves us? Are we willing to weep for a hurting world, to pray for those who are lost, and to share God's message even when it's not popular? Compassion isn't always convenient, but it's always worth it. As we reflect on Jeremiah's heart, let's ask ourselves, who in our lives needs to experience God's love through us? How can we extend compassion to those who seem far from God? Remember, just as Jeremiah's tears reflected God's heart, our kindness and empathy can be a glimpse of His love to those around us. Jeremiah's tears were more than a personal expression of sorrow. They were a reflection of God's profound love and heartbreak over His people's rebellion. Through Jeremiah, we see a God who doesn't stand distant from His creation, but enters into our struggles, feeling the weight of our choices. Have you ever considered that God grieves over us when we stray, much like a loving parent feels the pain of a wayward child? In Jeremiah's time, Judah was a nation drifting further from God. They had replaced worship of the Creator with idols and pursued their own desires at the expense of their covenant with Him. Jeremiah cried because he understood the consequences of their actions, separation from God and the destruction that would follow. His tears were not just human emotions. They were a mirror of God's aching heart. God's love is relentless, and Jeremiah's mission was proof of that. Instead of giving up on His people, God sent Jeremiah to call them back. It's a reminder for us today that no matter how far we've strayed, God's heart longs for us to return to Him. Jeremiah's tears serve as an invitation to reflect on our own lives. Is there an area where we've drifted from God's path? His love is always waiting to guide us back. Tears can be healing. For Jeremiah, they were a way to intercede for his people, pouring out his heart to God on their behalf. Have you ever wept in prayer for someone you love? Those moments of deep emotion are often the times when we feel closest to God, aligning our hearts with His. Jeremiah teaches us that it's okay to weep for a world in need because those tears carry the power of love and hope. Despite his sorrow, Jeremiah never gave up on his mission. He continued to preach, pray, and plead with the people, knowing that God's love was greater than their rebellion. This persistence is a powerful reminder that we are called to reflect God's love, even when it's hard. Love doesn't quit, it endures, even in the face of rejection. Jeremiah's tears also reveal a deeper truth about God's character. He is not a distant, uninvolved deity, but a loving Father who feels our pain and rejoices in our victories. His grief over Judah's sin wasn't about anger. It was about the broken relationship he longed to restore. In the same way, God longs for a relationship with us, even when we falter. If this message touched your heart, share in the comments how God's love has guided you through your own journey. Or simply type the word compassion to let us know you're walking with us on this spiritual path. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring biblical lessons that strengthen your faith. Jeremiah's mission was anything but easy. He was tasked with delivering a message of impending judgment to a nation that didn't want to listen. Imagine standing before an entire people, knowing that your words would provoke anger and resistance. Yet Jeremiah chose obedience over comfort. His courage reminds us that sometimes speaking the truth in love means stepping into difficult conversations, even when it's uncomfortable. The message Jeremiah carried was one of warning, but it was rooted in God's love. He wasn't sent to condemn, he was sent to call Judah back to their Creator. This balance between truth and love is something we all struggle with. How do we speak honestly without alienating others? Jeremiah's life shows us that it begins with a heart aligned with God's. When we approach others with genuine concern for their well-being, our words carry a different weight. One of the most challenging aspects of Jeremiah's role was the rejection he faced. The people ridiculed him, ignored him, and even sought to silence him. Yet, he didn't let their reactions deter him. How often do we shy away from sharing our faith or addressing important issues because we fear how others might respond? Jeremiah's story encourages us to be faithful, trusting that God will use our efforts, even when they seem fruitless. It's important to remember that Jeremiah's message wasn't his own, it was God's. This gave him the strength to persevere. When we're called to speak truth, we can take comfort in knowing that we don't stand alone. God equips us with the words and the courage we need, just as he did with Jeremiah. His promise in Jeremiah 1:19, "They will fight against you, but they shall not prevail against you," is a reminder that God's power is greater than any opposition we face. Speaking truth in love isn't just about what we say, it's also about how we live. Jeremiah's life was a testament to his message. His integrity and faithfulness added credibility to his words. For us, living out our faith authentically can often speak louder than words. Our actions reflect the God we serve, showing others the power of his love and grace. Jeremiah's courage challenges us to consider our own lives. Are there situations where we've hesitated to speak up, fearing rejection or discomfort? How can we lean on God's strength to share his truth in a way that invites others to experience his love? Sometimes, the most loving thing we can do is to offer a gentle but firm reminder of God's calling on our lives. As we reflect on Jeremiah's example, let's ask God to give us both the courage to speak truth and the wisdom to do it with love. It's not always easy, but as Jeremiah's life shows us, it's always worth it. Rejection is a painful experience, and Jeremiah knew it all too well. From the moment he began proclaiming God's message, he faced scorn, hostility, and even physical threats. Have you ever felt the sting of being misunderstood or dismissed, especially when you were trying to do the right thing? Jeremiah's story reminds us that rejection doesn't define us. Our faithfulness to God does. The people of Judah weren't just indifferent to Jeremiah's words, they were actively opposed to them. They accused him of treason, mocked his warnings, and tried to silence his voice. Yet, Jeremiah persisted. Why? Because his mission wasn't about pleasing people, it was about obeying God. This steadfastness is a powerful example for us when we face challenges in standing for our beliefs. Jeremiah's perseverance wasn't born from sheer willpower, but from a deep trust in God's calling. He knew that the one who sent him was also the one who sustained him. In Jeremiah 20:11 he declares, "The Lord is with me as a mighty, awesome one." This unshakable confidence in God's presence gave him the strength to endure, even when it seemed like the whole world was against him. What's remarkable is that Jeremiah didn't pretend to be unaffected by the rejection he faced. He poured out his frustrations to God in heartfelt prayers, often referred to as his confessions. Thus, in these raw and honest moments, Jeremiah teaches us that it's okay to bring our struggles to God. He welcomes our honesty and offers us the comfort and guidance we need to keep going. Jeremiah's faithfulness in the face of opposition also highlights the importance of resilience in our spiritual lives. When we encounter obstacles, it's easy to feel discouraged and want to give up. But like Jeremiah, we're called to persevere, trusting that God is working through us, even when the results aren't immediately visible. Our faithfulness matters, even when it feels like no one is listening. It's worth noting that Jeremiah wasn't alone in his journey. Though his message was unpopular, God placed people like Baruch, his faithful scribe, to support him. This reminds us that God often provides community and encouragement in unexpected ways. Who are the people in your life that uplift and support you in your walk with God? And how can you be that source of encouragement for someone else? Jeremiah's example encourages us to press on, even when the road is tough. Rejection may sting, but it doesn't have to derail us. With God's strength and the support of others, we can remain faithful to His calling, trusting that our perseverance will bear fruit in His perfect time. Amidst the warnings of destruction and calls for repentance, Jeremiah also carried a message of hope. It's easy to think of him as only the weeping prophet, but his words reveal a God who never gives up on His people. Even as Judah faced the consequences of their rebellion, Jeremiah's prophecies reminded them of God's unwavering love and His promise to restore them. Isn't it amazing how, even in our darkest moments, God's hope shines through? One of the most profound examples of this hope is found in Jeremiah 29:11, a verse many of us hold dear. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." These words were spoken to a people in exile, far from home and uncertain of their future. Yet God's promise was clear. This was not the end of their story. Jeremiah's prophecies of hope weren't just about a return to the land, but a deeper restoration of their relationship with God. In Jeremiah 31:33, he speaks of a new covenant, saying, "I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they shall be my people." This wasn't just a promise for Judah, it's a promise for us today. God desires a personal, transformative relationship with each of us. These messages of hope remind us that God's plans are always redemptive. Even when we face the consequences of our choices, He is at work, weaving His purposes into our lives. Have you ever looked back on a difficult season and seen how God brought something beautiful out of it? That's the kind of hope Jeremiah's prophecies point to, a hope that doesn't deny our struggles, but transforms them. Jeremiah's role as a prophet was to balance the reality of judgment with the promise of restoration. This duality reflects the heart of God, just and holy, yet full of mercy and grace. It's a reminder that God's discipline is never about punishment for its own sake, but about guiding us back to Him. His goal is always restoration. As we reflect on Jeremiah's words, we're invited to trust in God's plans, even when they don't make sense to us. Sometimes we can only see the next step, but God sees the whole picture. His promises are a steady foundation, giving us the courage to move forward in faith. What promises of God are you holding on to today? How can they anchor you in times of uncertainty? Jeremiah's prophecies of hope challenge us to look beyond our circumstances and cling to the God who holds our future. They remind us that no matter how far we've strayed, no matter how broken our situation seems, God's love can redeem and restore. His plans are always good, and His promises never fail. One of the most vivid and memorable moments in Jeremiah's ministry occurs when God sends him to the potter's house. Here, Jeremiah watches the potter working clay on the wheel, shaping and reshaping it as needed. God uses this scene to teach a profound lesson about His transformative power and sovereignty over our lives. Have you ever felt like clay in the hands of the potter, being shaped and molded by life's experiences? As Jeremiah observes, the potter notices a flaw in the vessel he's shaping. Instead of discarding the clay, he reworks it into something new and beautiful. In Jeremiah 18:6, God declares, "Like clay in the hand of the potter, so are you in my hand, Israel." Actually, this imagery is both humbling and comforting. It reminds us that even when we feel broken or unworthy, God doesn't discard us. He lovingly reshapes us. The potter's wheel represents the circumstances of our lives. Sometimes the process of being molded can feel uncomfortable or even painful. But it's through this shaping that God removes imperfections and refines our character. What challenges have you faced that, in hindsight, helped you grow closer to God? Like the potter, he is always working with care and purpose. This lesson also speaks to God's patience. Just as the potter doesn't rush the process, God works in his perfect timing. He knows what we need and when we need it. Jeremiah's visit to the potter's house is a reminder to trust the process even when we can't see the final outcome. God's hands are steady, and his vision for our lives is far greater than anything we could imagine. Another powerful aspect of this lesson is the role of surrender. Clay doesn't resist the potter, it yields to his hands. Similarly, we are called to surrender to God's will, trusting that he knows what's best for us. This isn't always easy, especially when life feels uncertain or overwhelming. But as we yield to him, we allow him to shape us into vessels for his glory. The story of the potter and the clay invites us to examine our own hearts. Are we willing to let God shape us even when it's uncomfortable? Do we trust him enough to let go of our own plans and embrace his? Jeremiah's experience reminds us that God's hands are gentle but firm, always working for our good. As we reflect on this lesson, let's find comfort in knowing that we are never beyond God's ability to reshape and restore. No matter our flaws or failures, we are in the hands of the master potter who is continually working to make us into something beautiful and useful for his purposes. Jeremiah's life was marked by hardship. From imprisonment to public humiliation, his suffering was a constant companion. Yet through it all, Jeremiah remained faithful to God's call. Have you ever wondered how someone can continue to trust God in the midst of such pain? Jeremiah's story reveals a profound truth. Faithfulness isn't about avoiding suffering. It's about trusting God to carry us through it. Jeremiah's suffering wasn't just physical, it was deeply emotional. He was ridiculed, rejected, and even called a traitor by his own people. In Jeremiah 29, he famously laments, "But if I say, I will not mention his word or speak any more in his name, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot." These words show a man torn between his pain and his passion for God's message. Despite his struggles, he couldn't silence the truth burning within him. One of the most inspiring aspects of Jeremiah's faithfulness is his willingness to be honest with God. He didn't hide his frustrations or doubts. Instead, he poured out his heart in raw, unfiltered prayers. This teaches us that faithfulness doesn't mean suppressing our emotions. It means bringing them to God. When we're honest with him, we open the door for his comfort and strength to sustain us. Jeremiah's faithfulness also reminds us of the importance of endurance. He didn't see immediate results from his ministry. In fact, much of his life was spent proclaiming a message that people refused to hear. Yet, he didn't give up. His perseverance is a testament to the power of trusting God's timing, even when it doesn't align with our own expectations. In our own lives, suffering can often feel isolating, but Jeremiah's story reminds us that we're never alone. God's presence was with him through every trial, offering reassurance and strength. This is a promise we can hold on to as well. No matter what we face, God is with us, walking beside us every step of the way. Another powerful lesson from Jeremiah is his unwavering belief in God's purpose. Even when he couldn't see the outcome, he trusted that his obedience mattered. This challenges us to ask, How can we remain faithful in our own seasons of struggle? What steps can we take to lean into God's presence when life feels overwhelming? As we reflect on Jeremiah's faithfulness, let's be encouraged by his example. His life reminds us that suffering is not the end of the story. With God, even our most painful seasons can become a testimony of his faithfulness and grace. We can trust him, just as Jeremiah did, to use our struggles for his glory. Jeremiah's life left a profound legacy, one that continues to teach us about the depth of God's love and the role we play in his story. His tears weren't just a sign of sorrow. They were a window into his compassion, his faith, and his commitment to God's call. What can we learn from a prophet who wept not out of weakness, but out of a profound understanding of God's heart? Jeremiah's tears remind us of the value of empathy. In a world that often encourages us to look out for ourselves, Jeremiah's life stands as a challenge to care deeply about others. His sorrow for Judah's sin shows us what it means to love people enough to hurt for them. Have you ever felt that kind of compassion for someone in need? It's not always easy, but it's one of the most powerful ways to reflect God's love. His legacy also teaches us the importance of aligning our hearts with God's. Jeremiah wept because he shared in God's grief over a wayward people. This challenges us to ask, do we see the world as God sees it? Are our hearts broken by the things that break his heart? Jeremiah's life invites us to pray for this kind of alignment, asking God to shape our desires, passions, and priorities according to his will. Another key lesson from Jeremiah's legacy is the power of perseverance. He didn't let rejection, hardship, or ridicule stop him from fulfilling his mission. His tears didn't signify defeat. They were a testament to his resilience and his refusal to give up. How often do we let obstacles discourage us from pursuing what God has called us to do? Jeremiah's example encourages us to keep going, trusting that our faithfulness matters. Jeremiah's life also challenges us to embrace vulnerability. In a culture that prizes strength and self-reliance, Jeremiah's willingness to weep openly reminds us that true strength is found in depending on God. His tears weren't a sign of failure. They were an expression of his deep relationship with God and his commitment to the people he served. It's a reminder that we, too, can bring our emotions and struggles to God, knowing that he welcomes them. As we look at Jeremiah's legacy, we're reminded that our own lives are part of a bigger story. Just as his tears pointed to God's love and mercy, our lives can be a reflection of his grace. What kind of legacy do we want to leave behind? How can we live in a way that points others to God's goodness, even in the midst of challenges? Jeremiah's tears teach us about the beauty of a life fully surrendered to God. They show us that even in sorrow, there is purpose. Even in struggle, there is hope. His legacy is an invitation to step into our own calling with courage, compassion, and a heart aligned with God's. Jeremiah's life speaks volumes to us even now, thousands of years later. His story isn't just about a prophet in ancient Judah. It's about a God who cares deeply for his people and calls us to reflect his heart in our own lives. What lessons can we take from Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, as we navigate our faith in today's world? First, Jeremiah's unwavering commitment to God's call challenges us to examine our own faithfulness. Life is full of distractions and difficulties, but Jeremiah shows us that following God's path is always worth it, even when it's hard. How can we, like Jeremiah, stay focused on God's purpose for our lives, trusting him through the ups and downs? Jeremiah also teaches us the importance of compassion. His tears weren't just for himself, they were for a nation that had turned away from God. In a world that often feels cold and divided, we're called to care deeply for others, praying for them and pointing them toward God's love. Who in your life needs to experience God's compassion through you today? Another lesson from Jeremiah is the value of perseverance. He faced rejection, ridicule, and suffering, yet he never wavered in his mission. This reminds us that faithfulness isn't about immediate results. It's about trusting God to use our efforts in His time and His way. How can we stay committed to God's call even when we don't see the fruit of our labor? Jeremiah's life also invites us to embrace honesty in our relationship with God. His prayers were raw and unfiltered, full of emotion and vulnerability. He didn't hide his struggles. He brought them to God, trusting that God could handle his doubts and fears. This openness is a powerful reminder that we too can come to God just as we are, knowing that He welcomes us with love and understanding. Finally, Jeremiah's story challenges us to trust in God's plans, even when they're hard to understand. His prophecies of judgment were always paired with promises of hope, showing us that God's ultimate goal is restoration. When life feels uncertain, we can hold on to this truth. God is always working for our good, even in the midst of difficulties. Jeremiah's legacy is one of faith, compassion, and perseverance. His tears were a testament to his deep connection with God and his commitment to his calling. As we reflect on his story, let's ask ourselves, how can we live with that same passion and purpose? How can we align our hearts with God's, trusting Him to use us for His glory? Jeremiah's story is one of profound faith and unshakable hope. Despite rejection, suffering, and countless tears, he remained faithful to God's call, demonstrating what it means to trust in His plans even when life feels overwhelming. His legacy challenges us to align our hearts with God's, to care deeply for those around us, and to embrace the redemptive power of His love. As we reflect on Jeremiah's life, let's carry his lessons into our own. Like the potter shaping the clay, God is at work in each of us, transforming our brokenness into beauty. No matter where you are in your journey, take heart. God's plans are always good, and His promises never fail. Let's close with a prayer. Lord, thank You for the example of Jeremiah, whose faithfulness inspires us to trust in You. Help us to reflect Your compassion, persevere in our calling, and embrace the hope You offer, even in difficult times. Mold us into vessels for Your glory, and guide us in showing Your love to those around us. Amen. If Jeremiah's story has touched your heart, share this message with friends and family who might need encouragement today. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring biblical lessons that strengthen your faith and deepen your connection with God.